You're listening to the Monocle Daily, first broadcast on the 31st of January 2025 on Monocle Radio.
Syria's new leader addresses his people for the first time. Is the era of cooperation between Germany's mainstream and far-right parties over already? And microwaving coffee definitively proved to be the behaviour of deviants, if not downright monsters. I'm Andrew Mueller. The Monocle Daily starts now. Hello and welcome to the Monocle Daily, coming to you from our studios here at Midori House in London. I'm Andrew Mueller. It's Friday, so it's our weekly in-house daily, and the Monocle staffers who pinned their tails furthest from the donkey were Leila Molana-Allen, Cermak, Grace Charlton and Fernando Augusto Pacheco. They all discuss the day's big stories and formally launch our hilariously premature coverage of Eurovision 2025. Plus, we'll have our regular wrap-up of what we've learned since this time last week. Stay tuned, all that and more coming up right here on the Monocle Daily. This is the Monocle Daily. I'm Andrew Mueller, and I am joined first of all in the studio by Leila Molana-Allen, Monocle's Middle East correspondent, and Chris Cermak, Monocle Radio's senior news editor. Hello to you both.
Hi.
Leila, we will be talking about Syria shortly, so by way of light introductory banter, let's not talk about Syria right now. But where else have you been lately of interest, or where else are you going imminently of interest? Please don't say nowhere to both of those questions.
No, well, just before Syria, I was in Lebanon several times during the war and the aftermath of the war. And before that, I was in Sudan covering that war. I'm hoping to go back to Sudan very soon. The impact of Trump pulling humanitarian aid from all these places is already becoming devastating. Potentially Afghanistan as well. That's another one where we're already seeing huge problems as a result of that. It's really having a hugely widespread impact. And as ever, we are still trying to get into Gaza, having not been allowed in as international journalists for 16 months, something completely unheard of. The reason that we were given by the Israeli government for months and months was our own safety. There is now a ceasefire and there's no reason not to allow us in. So we continue to apply pressure. And we hope that nations and governments will apply pressure too for a free press to be allowed inside and to relieve the incredibly brave Palestinian journalists who've been covering that war for so long and need a break to rebuild their lives and their homes.
And Chris, what about you? Have you? I think last time we did this with you, like you just bought a mattress. Can you improve on that?
To be fair, I had bought a bed that I was putting together in between going to Donald Trump's inauguration in the United States. So I put one half of the bed together before the inauguration, the other half of the bed together after the inauguration. So there was that. And in terms of my own travels, I'm going to go from elections in the world's largest economy to Europe's largest economy, because I will be in Germany for the elections coming up later on this month, which we will also be talking about on this show. So it'll be interesting to return to Berlin. It's been quite a while since I've been there, so I covered much of this back in 2015, 2016, in those years. Some of the things we'll be talking about on this show as well, but it'll be interesting to see the environment over there.
Well, bed's quite the linchpin, because I have been living out of cardboard boxes. I travel so much since I moved into my new flat, embarrassingly, nearly 2 years ago, and I actually disassembled my rickety old bed that I was using temporarily before I left for Sudan, so that I would have to do something about it. And I, for the first time in my life, as a Christmas gift to myself, after 6 months on the road, bought a new mattress. And I realised, because I've always just accepted whatever was there, that I didn't know how to select a mattress. And for the first time, I don't have back pain. And I'm shocked by the fact that, because I have a proper new nice mattress that's kind to my body, that actually that's possible.
Well, that all turned out to be for the fact that we had not discussed or arranged any light introductory banter at all and completely winged it. Surprisingly coherent, really. But we will start in Syria, where new interim President Ahmed al-Shara has made his first televised address to the nation. The text was maybe, on balance, sufficient to nourish the cautious optimism which followed last month's overthrow of President Bashar al-Assad after the swift offensive of al-Shara's Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, still widely officially designated designated a terrorist organisation. Al-Shara, in his speech, promised peace, the dissolution of non-state militias, a national conference to contemplate the way forward, and the pursuit of criminals associated with the former regime. Leila, you have been in Syria since the fall of Assad, and you were there to see the first weeks of Al-Shara's seizure of power and the immediate aftermath. Thinking about what he had to say in this speech, are you buying all of it?
Definitely not buying all of it. There have been great concerns, of course, since the beginning. For anybody who doesn't have the exact background, Ahmed al-Shara is a jihadist. He was the head of Jabhat al-Nusra, which was one of the jihadi groups that fought in Syria for many years during the ISIS period. They were linked to al-Qaeda. They were also linked to ISIS, but had falling outs with them. And they then started running Idlib in West Aleppo, the rebel-held area in the north. They transformed in 2015 into Hayat Tahrir al-Sham. And then from about 2017, 2018, started this liberalizing agenda. Now, what was so interesting, among the many interesting things about being in Syria at that time, was I'd managed to get into Idlib several times, which was incredibly difficult the year before. I'd also managed to get into regime-held Syria undercover, and I'd been in the northeast, so I had sort of very recent experience of all these places. And hearing from fighters in Idlib who this move towards invading the rest of the country had actually been planned for about 4 years, which no one expected or realised except those inside. And what Hayat Tahrir al-Sham and Shara had been doing was essentially saying, you know, we are going to become more liberal, trying to recruit people from other more liberal factions like the Free Syrian Army. And they'd managed to do so very successfully. And that's why they had such great manpower to sweep down through the country. Now, from the first days, he was saying, you know, it's going to be a Syria for all Syrians. There's going to be amnesties for army conscripts who never wanted to fight associated with the Assads, etc. But there were immediately concerns already in the early days. Women saying things like HTS fighters in the streets are saying to female judges, female doctors, oh, you won't be working for long. And part of the problem is that, you know, when they all had one common objective, which was to take Syria, they're all working on the same thing. But this is a hugely diverse group of people who are united under this HTS flag, as well as their associated other militias. So, you know, he's got a really great challenge. What I do believe is that he's an incredibly smart guy. He really understands how to speak to people. He's a very religious man himself, and he noticed that people got very upset in the first few days when he wouldn't take pictures with women without headscarves. So he's changed that, and he's realised that, you know, just the optics of that are not good. He immediately started setting up meetings with foreign leaders. So I think everything he's saying is his good intentions at the very least. What's clear is that this is still going to be an authoritarian government. You know, I mean, already the press is being cracked down upon. Access is much more difficult. They're very carefully monitoring who's moving in and out of the country. One of the things that's going to be a big challenge is this idea he has of trying to dissolve all the different rebel factions and militia factions, because he's got to make sure that they all feel they're still fighting for something under a national army. And of course, they've got to think about the Syrian Democratic Forces, Kurdish forces in eastern Syria who've had an autonomous area for a long time. You know, he's said, look, we're not going to allow any form of autonomy, but we believe the Kurds are as much part of the Syrian people as anyone else. If that's true, then that's wonderful, because they've never been properly accepted and treated well. But the really sort of big clangor which upset a lot of people in this speech was the fact that he made himself president and said there wouldn't be any imminent elections. Now, it's not that people didn't think he would become president. Everyone expected that. But lots of Syrian civil society groups, lots of people who've come back to the country feel very strongly that there should be elections to allow them to sort of build a political infrastructure.
I mean, he does have a case here in that obviously holding elections in Syria, certainly now or in the immediate future, would just be asking for trouble, wouldn't it? Is his pitch, do you think, that the first thing he has to do is first try and hold Syria together in one piece, and then second to create something resembling a functional unitary state, which obviously Syria hasn't had for more than a decade?
That's exactly it. I mean, the challenges here are untold, right? We're talking about, I mean, for instance, when we were there, infrastructure was already bad because of the years of war and sanctions. But we're talking about trying to rebuild roads, which have been ripped up for years. We're talking about trying to figure out how you instill security when now there aren't checkpoints anymore, which people are very happy about. We're talking about at least half the population trying to rebuild their destroyed homes when there isn't efficient sewage, there isn't proper electricity, they don't have enough petrol for the cars, people are smuggling petrol in from Lebanon, right? So these are very basic issues. Then you've got security. You know, where do you direct the manpower? Do you direct it to the roads where already we've got armed bandits taking advantage of the situation? Do you direct it towards ministries and trying to rebuild that kind of infrastructure? And then, of course, you've got the issue of trying to convince Western powers to lift sanctions, to properly sponsor this government, to get involved, to send agencies back in to help with the rebuild, etc. And you've got to try and convince all the Syrians abroad to come back to and help rebuild their country. So he's certainly got an argument that they've got to sort of get on with the job of keeping the country stable, as well as all the outside threats, like the Turks have started bombing the border again, and they've got a very strong interest in keeping control of that northern border, which they had in Idlib for so long. And you've got issues with the Americans in eastern Syria working with the Kurds, and the Kurds wanting to hold on to autonomy. All these problems. And then, of course, you've got the Israelis who've come in and taken over territory in the Golan Heights, which is absolutely not disputed territory, what they've pushed into. This is Syrian territory we're talking about, but they're holding on to it, and they're shooting anybody who tries to come near them. So huge number of issues to deal with. On the other hand, he's got to be incredibly careful that what he is marketing as a stabilization agenda is not seen as yet more oppression. What everybody in the streets told me repeatedly as I rocked around the country for weeks in this newfound environment of freedom was, look, we'll believe them. We'll give them a chance. Mm-hmm. They've come down and they've liberated us, and we'll support anyone who liberates us, but we will not have an oppressor again. So he's got to be very careful that this is not seen as authoritarianism and an oppressive government, because people who have finally had this yoke lifted from their backs after 14 years of hell and arguably half a century of hell, these are not people, I think, who will stand for it again.
Just finally on this, Chris, what have you made so far of the way that foreign governments, especially Western governments, have responded to the new situation? Because Al-Shaara's organisation has not been de-designated a foreign terrorist organisation by many people yet. And there is, of course, a long and inglorious history of Western governments being perfectly content with authoritarian governments in the Middle East as long as they keep everything quiet. How cagey or otherwise are people being about the prospect of this one?
It does feel pretty cagey with the whole thing, doesn't it? On the one hand, you have leaders visiting Damascus and sort of giving the right noises in the same way about wanting to give this regime a chance. On the other hand, as you say, they are still designated a terrorist organization. So there is a certain contradiction there, and it'll be very interesting to watch. The other thing that for me is interesting to watch is the other country being Russia, which of course had such a relationship with Syria. And I find the interplay, if you will, between the US, Europe, and Russia is going to be fascinating. Russia visited Deputy Foreign Minister for the first time this week. They want to keep their bases, 2 bases that they have in Syria on the Mediterranean. I'm curious how far, in a way, all these countries are willing to go to work with this Syrian regime. Syria, the president basically said, or as I understand, they want Assad to be extradited from Moscow back to Syria. They also want reparations from Moscow. If Moscow is willing to play ball on that in order to maybe keep its bases, then suddenly Moscow and Russia look like the good ones, while Europe and the US are holding out when it comes to terrorist groups and so on and so forth. So the dynamic between these great powers, as always, will be fascinating.
Well, let's move along just somewhat and look at Germany, on the politics of which Syria's recent travails have had a considerable influence. It is not difficult to spot the relationship between Germany's acceptance of millions of mostly Syrian refugees in 2015 and subsequent surges in support for the far-right immigrant-unfriendly party Alternative for Germany, or AfD. Earlier this week, the opposition Christian Democratic Union prompted outrage, including from its own former leader, Angela Merkel, by getting a non-binding resolution on immigration through the Bundestag with AfD support. Within the last couple of hours, however, a broadly similar bill, though again supported by the CDU and the AfD, has been defeated. Chris, what changed?
What changed was, the last 24 hours in German politics have really been quite incredible in terms of the divisiveness of this move. It can't really be overstated how much of a shockwave this caused simply by the Christian Democrats, the center-right, for one time and the only time, the first time ever, basically saying we are going to let something pass with the help of the far right. That caused a huge amount of debate over the last 24 hours. As you said, Angela Merkel intervened against her own Party saying they should not have done this. And you've had extraordinary scenes in the Bundestag today. The arguments, the viciousness of the arguments from both sides, the passions from both sides really suggested that the middle has kind of broken in Germany at this point. You had the Social Democrats and the Greens on one side, and then you had the Christian Democrats defending themselves and sort of, but not really defending the AfD by extension by saying they wanted this bill passed. What seems to have happened, at least from what we know of this vote, is that there were enough Christian Democratic parliamentarians who were not willing to go along with this. There were also a number of Free Democrats, which is the smaller sort of libertarian, if you will, party, that were also not willing to go along with this. So they just about did not get enough in order for this bill to pass. But it was still, nonetheless, a bill that was supported by a majority of Christian Democrats and a majority of the Alternative for Germany. And that is an incredible shift in German politics.
I mean, Leila, just to look at this situation from the other end of it, i.e. from Syria, there would, of course, now be many millions of Syrians who have lived in Germany for a decade, have raised thoroughly German children, started German businesses, and probably feel like, well, this is where I live now. But do you get any sense that there is at any point going to be a huge rush back to Syria of those many Syrians who left? And if there is, how will that change modern Syria? Because these will be people who've been living mostly in the West.
There is absolutely going to be a huge rush back. I mean, one of the, the sort of prevailing things that anti-refugee activists or politicians around the world use, this kind of idea that people are trying to sneak in and they're using any opportunity to get to these countries. That's simply not the case. As somebody who's spent essentially my entire life on the refugee trail because I'm a war correspondent and that's war makes refugees. People leave because they have to. People take these risks because they have to. The night that Damascus fell, at 3 a.m., the road from Lebanon, from Beirut to Damascus, was so full that your car could not move along it. People literally drove to the border for when it opened and then discovered that there was nobody there guarding it and just started driving home. And when I say home, I mean to flattened piles of rubble. People are desperate to go home. Syrians love their country, as do so many other people who are refugees. Now, of course, people who are, and remember that many of the Syrian refugees around the world are still living in camps, are living in hotels, are living in whatever kind of internment centres many European nations have had for them. The Turks are doing something really interesting and clever, because there are a few problems here. Of course, one of the reasons that people are so heavily in favour of Western nations supporting this new Syria is because if they can make Syria functional, people will go back. And Syrian refugees in particular, but refugees across the board, have become such a contentious issue in politics over the last decade. So, people are leaning very heavily towards let's give them a chance. Syria was a very prosperous, profitable country before, it didn't have huge emigration at all. It was an oppressive country, but one in which people were sort of happy and did well and were highly educated. People who have properly settled and been properly integrated into European nations, there is a lower chance that they will leave. However, what's interesting, and I can say this as the child of a refugee myself, my mother escaped Iran at the end of the Iran-Iraq war, and I was born in the UK, and I've spent my entire life back in the Middle East. Even if the parents don't go back, the children tend to. There is a longing for home. There is a longing for your culture, and often become some of the most productive and great members of Western society because they have that dual ability, that dual mentality, and are able to start great businesses and do really well in politics, and they speak multiple languages. But the kind of real weight, actually, on European society, and to a certain extent in North America as well, is the ones who have not been processed, right? And those are the people who I do think will go back, and it's already lifted a huge burden off Lebanon, for instance. And so what I was saying about Turkey, just to close, is that Turkey's doing something very clever, where they're not going against the sort of UN rules where you cannot force a refugee to go back when you're not sure somewhere's safe. They've introduced this thing called home visit. So now Syrians who were never allowed to return across the border if they went back are allowed to go for 2 weeks. And you're still allowed to return on your papers. And the point being, you can go back and check if your home is still standing and check if it's okay. And so you will take the risk of driving back because you'll be allowed to come back to Turkey. And their hope is that people will go back and realise that they can rebuild their homes, but they won't be so afraid of losing their refugee status that they won't try it. If everyone else tried that, potentially at least half people would actually stay.
Well, to move along to something entirely different, not at all related to anything we've previously discussed, and frankly a good deal less important, it is a question which has troubled nobody I have ever met, but here we go. A boffin at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology has deployed all the formidable expertise and equipment of that institution to conclusively demonstrate that putting your coffee in the microwave does not bring out the best in the beverage. Professor Jeffrey Grossman, for it is he, undertook this undertaking for the noblest of motives, i.e. to prove a point to his father, who is apparently a coffee microwaver. Chris, first of all, are you now or have you ever been a microwaver of coffee?
Oh, God, do I have to admit this on air? I have, on occasion, microwaved coffee, but I did not like the results, so I concur with the findings of the MIT lab. I will say, though, I proudly do use instant coffee in the mornings when I don't really care that much about the taste. So, yes, my coffee sort of tastes
instant coffee, Chris. This is
coffee.
a side
but
of
having
you
then tried,
I had not previously
But having then tried to
seen,
microwave it,
me.
I did realize was a step too far.
It takes almost no effort to make proper coffee using a cafetiere. It's actually probably in many respects easier than making instant coffee.
Easier, but I'm so used to it. This is actually a family thing, not to throw my family under the bus here, but yes, we're just instant coffee drinkers. This is a tradition in our family. I mean, proud tradition.
Leila, as a person of the Middle East, I mean, I cannot do justice to our listeners the appalled expression on your face right now.
Well, what I will say is that instant coffee has entered my life on two occasions. One, of course, is on the road when you don't know if you're going to get hold of anything, and anything, you can carry around some instant coffee with you for absolute desperation.
I will not only allow that, I will confess to having lapsed similarly in similar circumstances.
Well, it's the early morning, though, not
well,
a
the
form
other one,
of
exactly that.
desperation.
The only other time I have it is when it's 6:45 and I'm bleary-eyed and I've got to be on the Globalist at 7 a.m. for a Monocle Radio hit, and I have a quick cup of instant before I make my lovely... But I am a coffee addict, and I make a huge French press, or recueil, as we call it in the Middle East, of coffee every morning. My gastroenterologist must be absolutely furious, and what I tend to do is bring back coffee from the places I've travelled to, completely devoted. I'm currently obsessed with Sudanese coffee, into which they call something called dawa, and I brought back bags and bags of coffee from Port Sudan. Dawa is ginger root, and you mix ginger root into your coffee every morning. The old ladies do it, they call it medicine. It brightens your eyes up. So the idea of putting that into a microwave is horrifying. However, I do sit there for hours doing emails, reading the news, whatever else in the morning. So what I figured out now is that I make my pot far too strong, and I keep the kettle boiled, and I top it up with hot water as I go.
See, this is good thinking. If I could, you did, however, kind of have me at coffee with ginger root, which one sounds absolutely amazing, but two makes me slightly concerned that I would never sleep again.
Well, you would never have it past 10 a.m., do you? And interestingly, this is a cultural thing. The Japanese do exactly the same thing. So it's something to do with ancient cultures, understanding the way that this kind of invigorates you alongside the caffeine.
There must be
even this instant coffee drinker is willing to give that a try.
There must be some...
Maybe it's a new line for Nescafe,
There must be somewhere in London you can get this. This is this weekend's mission. Leila Molana-Allen and Chris Cermak, thank you both for joining us on the Monocle Daily. You're listening to The Daily on Monocle Radio, and we'll cross over to the Danish capital now, where Grace Charlton, Monocle's associate editor covering fashion, joins us from, and we've already given you a hint, Copenhagen Fashion Week. Grace, hello, what are they wearing in Copenhagen?
Hi, Andrew. I'm so excited to talk fashion with you. I know this is one of your favourite topics. What people are wearing here are big coats, big fluffy hats, and you might have guessed it's quite cold.
But are they wearing big coats and fluffy hats of a particular style or trend in any way emblematic of early 2025?
Ooh, early 2000. Oh, I see what you mean. January 2025. They're sort of reimagining silhouettes that maybe I associate personally more with the 80s, which has been quite interesting. But yeah, the hats are huge. They're kind of like shirting vibes. like chapkas. Do you know what I mean?
Very, very slightly. For those of us old enough to remember the 80s the first time, generally with a shudder, what aspects of the decade do people appear to be interested in?
I think they're interested in the big shoulders and the drama that they can bring to silhouette. And I think they're also interested in the big gold jewelry.
Are you seeing any designers in particular getting excited about this stuff?
Yeah, I've seen Caro Editions, which is a brand founded by Caroline Billabrahe, who's a bit of a Copenhagen legend. And I've also seen Gestutz, another Copenhagen brand, do the same thing. Bauman Garden are always very inspired by the 80s. But it's also in the choice of music on the runway. Like, I've had In Excess being played. Isn't that crazy?
Yes, which must have made you somewhat homesick.
Yeah, always.
Weird though that is, again, to those of us who can remember it all the first time, beyond that, do you get a sense that, and because I'm asking because this has come up when talking about other fashion shows recently, that Copenhagen is as all about sustainability as all the others?
Yeah, I think they've really pioneered this sustainability framework that they've asked all the brands that they work with to uphold, and that includes like equal hiring opportunities, so more social sustainability, if you will, as well as textiles and traceability. They've never tired of it, which I think you really have to give them credit for. And it's sort of taken off to the point that the British Fashion Council has now adopted this framework for London Fashion Week. So a huge win for Copenhagen.
But are we seeing that ideal of sustainability reflected in the clothes themselves? And I guess it's, if you think of the Scandinavian stereotype of rugged practicality, are we seeing designers actually emphasizing that these are things that will last, both in terms of, I guess, of their physical construction and of their stylishness, i.e. this is not something that will fall apart in 2 years or that you will feel like an idiot for wearing 6 months from now?
100%. And I mean, the stereotype of Scandinavian minimalism is very true. And it is that, for lack of a better term, timeless. So I think they've really done that super well. One of my favorite shows was Bonetje, which is a really young and emerging Danish brand. And they retailor men's suits and make them look really cool and really structured, but also a little bit unexpected with cutouts. And yeah, I think it's definitely stuff that you want to invest in and keep forever.
Well, what else has leapt out at you as a particular highlight?
Ooh, I really liked Studio MKDT. They have a new creative director called Caroline Engelgart, and her collection was just so stunning. It was held at the National Museum of Art amidst all these sculptures. And it was a little bit austere, a little bit introspective, and the clothes were just stunning. And it was really like the devil is in the detail, like little bit trims of leather and 70s sharp collars. So it was very inspiring.
And just finally, at that show or any of the others, if you were able to make off yourself with one particular garment, is there one you would have picked on?
Oh, that's such a good question. Wait, I'm gonna have to think about it for 2 seconds. There was this really silly hat at actually a brand called The Garment. I'd hesitate to call it a fez, but it had that boxy upward structure, and it was in, I think it was white silk. I think that would really elevate my office outfits.
We look forward to seeing it when you're back. Grace Charlton in Copenhagen in a fancy hat. Thank you for joining us. And now on the Daily, much like one of those unbelievably annoying shops which starts hanging stockings and mistletoe in September, we're going to talk about the Eurovision Song Contest in January. And I'm joined now by Monocle's Eurovision desk chief, Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Fernando, question one, what are we doing?
Well, we're talking serious stuff here. And by the way, our Eurovision coverage will increase this year, Andrew, because this week...
Sorry, what?
I've attended my first semi-final draw of Eurovision
ever. Semi-final draw?
Yes.
Oh my God.
I went to Basel for it, in fact. There was a special event for the media because it is a big event. I mean, it's one of the biggest, TV shows in the whole world. I mean, I think the only ones that can compete perhaps is the World Cup, the Olympics, if so.
Well, so you attended the draw in Basel for the Eurovision Song Contest semi-finals. Now, these are, of course, the preliminary rounds in which, frankly, anybody can have a lash, and anybody does. And we've discussed this before, Fernando. We're both actually quite against the concept of semi-finals, aren't you? I think one of the few things we agree on Eurovision-wise is that if you need to include everybody in Europe and the contest goes on for 9 goddamn hours, then so be it.
Well, yes, I do agree with you, but I understand the EBU. Otherwise, the show would be a mammoth. It's already a mammoth. I think it's almost 4 hours or something like that. And, you know, Montenegro decided to come back. There are a lot of countries...
Oh, my God.
Yeah, that's big news.
I really think it's just been nothing without Montenegro these last however many years Montenegro hasn't been in it.
I personally been missing the people from Montenegro at the show. But the semi-final is interesting because, of course, the first one on Tuesday before the big show on Saturday and the second one on Thursday. And I've been looking at the countries. I mean, when Sweden is in a semi-final, you're in danger. So I think the first semi-final perhaps is the stronger one because Ukraine is also in there. And it's not just because of the war. The Ukraine has been such a consistent country Eurovision-wise. I think almost every year they go to the big final. And the Netherlands as well. They're also very good. Australia is in the second semi-final. I'm not saying much else.
This is our year. Have you or anybody else heard a note of any of the songs yet?
Well, it's early days, but we've seen...
To say the very least, Fernando. This is, what, 3 months away or something?
But on a serious note, I've already started to notice a few trends. For example, France and the Netherlands, they haven't released the song, but they picked the artist.
Go on.
So France went with Luan. Luan is a very famous singer in France. She sold millions of copies. So they didn't go for someone who is unknown, which is sometimes the case with Eurovision. They go for upcoming artists. The Netherlands as well, they went with Claude, which we played some songs by Claude here on the radio.
Did you say Clog or Claude?
Claude.
Okay, fine.
Okay. And controversial enough, and we need to talk about the controversies as well.
We have to talk about the controversies, Fernando, because as you well know, they're my favourite bit.
Oh, but this one is very serious, actually. We're talking about the Israeli contestant, Yuval Raphael. She was one of the attack survivors of Hamas.
She was at the Nova Music Festival.
She was very much so there, and I think Israel was doing a big budget for her. I mean, it's quite a big deal for the country. But remember last year, it was an extremely controversial Eurovision. I was there in Malmö. The security was everywhere. And I managed to talk with Martin Osterdahl, the executive director of Eurovision. And he said, listen, we always try to make the event as safe as possible. And there are challenges today. Remember, Europe is at war, and not only that. And I think the artists themselves, they are more outspoken. So some people might be pro-Israel, other people will be anti-Israel. So there's so many challenges in such a big event like this as well.
So what actually goes on at the draw? Do they pull? Is it like the FA Cup draw where they pull little balls out of a bag? Did you get to pick one? How does it work?
Unfortunately, I didn't. And yes, they do pick balls from bowls. And because they're Swiss, because there's a lot of paper involved somehow. They had a recycling bin there, and they made fun of the Swedish because the Swedish didn't kind of recycle when they had this draw. And they said, we're Swiss, we recycle, of course. So they make a big point of that. It couldn't be more Swiss than that semi-final draw. It was not necessarily the most glamorous event in the world, but it was at the Kunsthaus, so I think, a very famous museum in Basel. So it was a way to show their art as well. It was all very Swiss, and that's what I like about Eurovision, showcasing kind of your soft power as well.
We would be a way off, though, presumably, from any idea of what the venue will actually look like for the big event?
Yes, that's very much, of course, the city is already preparing the hotels. I mean, occupancy. Basically, if you're looking for a hotel in Basel, I can tell you that. Good luck. It's hard. It's very hard to find one. But of course, the venue, I think at the moment, it's not quite Eurovision yet. But I think in the coming months, they would definitely start doing some work there.
Well, Fernando, just finally, as we have foreshadowed, this conversation is the beginning of months of absolutely merciless coverage from you and your many colleagues on Monocle's Eurovision desk. But this far out, if you had £10 to stick on the outcome, even knowing we don't know really what a lot of the entrants are going to be. Who do you think might be an early favourite?
I would put £10 on France. It's been a while.
And they're sending someone proper, right? They've come here to win this year.
Luan, who is also on the Monocle Radio playlist. So, of course, I'll put my £10 to France.
Fernando, Augusto, Pacheco from Monocle's Eurovision desk, thank you for joining us. Finally on today's show, it is time for our weekly assessment of what the last 7 days have taught us. We learned this week that we are all doomed. We learned this, again and as usual, from the friendless nerds at the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists, who, as they have annually since 1947, clambered free of the lockers into which they had last been stuffed by the football team, rearranged their most recent wedgies, pushed their sellotaped glasses back up their noses, stashed the pens back in the breast pockets of their short-sleeved shirts, and wheeled out their silly doomsday clock to sonorously caution us of impending apocalypse.
The world has not made sufficient progress on existential risks threatening all of humanity. We thus move the clock forward. In setting the clock closer to midnight, we send a stark signal.
Is it that girls still won't talk to you? We learned, anyway, that the lonely Poindexters believe that we are more doomed than ever.
It is now 89 seconds to midnight. This is the closest the world has ever been to midnight.
Happy New Year to you too, lads. You'll be right eventually. On which thought? We learned that recently reinstalled US President Donald Trump actually wasn't kidding when he nominated as his Secretary of State for Health Robert F. Kennedy Jr., or at least that Trump was willing to let the gag go as far as Senate confirmation hearings, where history's distant second most impressive Robert F. Kennedy would face the formidable obstacles of everything he has ever written, everything he has ever said, and everything he has ever done.
The receipts show that Mr. Kennedy has embraced conspiracy theories, quacks, charlatans, especially when it comes to the safety and efficacy of vaccines. He has made it his life's work to sow doubt and discourage parents from getting their kids life-saving vaccines. It has been lucrative for him and put him on the verge of immense power.
We learned, however, that the thinking of the raspy-throated whale-beheading bear corpse dumper has evolved on at least a few fronts. A bit. Possibly. Hard to tell.
Did you say Lyme disease is a highly likely militarily engineered bioweapon?
I probably did say that.
Did you say that?
And that's what the developer of Lyme
I want all of
disease
our
said.
colleagues to hear it, Mr. Kennedy. I want them to hear it. You said yes. Did you say that exposure to pesticides causes children to become transgender?
No, I never said that.
Okay, I have the record that I'll give to the chairman, and he can make his judgment about what you said.
For we learned that while the RFK-founded organisation Children's Health Defence sells infant onesies boasting of the unvaccinated status of the irresponsibly raised child swaddled therein,
your organisation is making money selling a child's product to parents for $26, which casts fundamental doubt on the usefulness of vaccines.
Can you guess?
All of my kids are vaccinated.
We should probably pace ourselves, though. There has to be at least another 3 months of material in RFK before Trump sacks him, derides him as a total wacko and loser, and pretends they never even met. And at any rate, we learned from elsewhere that there may actually be someone in this world less fit for public office, if possibly better dressed. Do we have some generic Portuguese music? For we learned what may have happened to our bags. Literally every goddamn time we've flown with a particular airline, our lawyers tell us we won't be mentioning by name. We learned that a member of Portugal's actual parliament, Miguel Arruda, of the far-right Chega party, had been accused of stealing luggage from airport baggage claim, then retailing the contents online, as an agog nation was informed.
André Ventura diz que foi o Chega que denunciou a situação das Maldas em que Miguel Arruda é arguido por furto.
O líder do partido pede que o deputado renuncie ao mandato.
We go now to our Portugal desk chief, Carlota Rebelo, for rigorously accurate translation and meticulously detailed context.
Yep, that's pretty much what they're saying.
Thanks, Carlota. That has expanded our understanding tremendously. Portuguese police investigating the case found 17 items of luggage in Arruda's home. If one of them is a battered antler rucksack in beige, orange tags on the zips, bit of a rip in one of the outer pockets, they can drop it round here whenever they're ready. We learned also, it should be noted, that Mr. Arruda denies everything, claiming that the widely enjoyed footage of him taking his pick from the carousels may have been generated by AI. And we, for one whimsical news review, earnestly wish him all the best with that defence. And we learned, possibly for the very first time in the history of Anglo-French relations, that the United Kingdom was prepared to make even the vaguest effort to avoid upsetting its neighbours across the Channel, thereby forestalling any eruptions of this kind of thing.
Non, vraiment, non.
We learned that the Royal Navy had decided on mature reflection not to name their latest astute-class submarine, HMS Agincourt, apparently for fear of stirring up unhappy memories of this ilk.
The game's afoot. Follow your spirit, and upon this charge, cry God for Harry, England, and St. George!
And yes, we know that's from Henry V before the Siege of Harfleur, not the Battle of Agincourt. Don't write in. The clip just fit better than any excerpts from the St. Crispin's Day speech. Shut up. We learned anyway that the boat in question will instead be called HMS Achilles, from which we learn that clearly the Royal Navy isn't too worried about offending any Trojans, and also that they're remarkably insouciant about naming a submarine of all craft after someone best recalled for having a small fatal weakness via which they could be rendered inoperable by a puncture. We therefore learned mostly, and frankly much to our disappointment, of the betrayal of a centuries-old and mutually treasured tradition of cross-channel baiting and bickering, though we for one humorous current affairs monologue believe that it is not too late for amends to be made, and note that there is plenty of room along the side of a submarine, for HMS Napoleon died a broken man in a British prison. That is all for this edition of the Monocle Daily. Thanks to all our guests today, Leila Molana-Allen, Chris Cermak, Grace Charlton and Fernando Augusto Pacheco. Today's show was produced by Carlota Rebelo and researched by Gunnar Gronlid. Our sound engineer was Steph Chungu. I'm Andrew Mueller here in London. The Daily is back at the same time on Monday. Thanks for listening.